I knew my neighbor Karen was trouble from the first time I caught her glaring at my yard like it was a personal affront to her perfectly manicured suburban existence. She had that kind of face that seemed permanently twisted into a scowl, the corners of her mouth etched into a deep, judgmental frown, like she'd been personally insulted by the very concept of untrimmed hedges and slightly crooked garden gnomes. She had made it her personal mission to critique every aspect of my landscaping, from the slightly overgrown rose bushes to the wild ivy creeping up my fence to the old rusted windmill I had proudly planted in the center of my flower bed. That windmill was my prize possession, a piece of rustic charm I'd hauled back from a cross-country road trip through the Midwest. It had seen better days, sure, its once bright red and white paint now faded and chipped, its metal blades creaking and groaning in the wind like an old ship at sea. But it had character. It stood tall and proud, spinning slowly in the breeze, its blades catching the morning sun and casting long, sharp shadows across my lawn like the skeletal fingers of some long-forgotten giant. Karen, of course, hated it. She'd complained about it to the HOA more times than I could count, her shrill, nasally voice echoing through the neighborhood like a broken smoke alarm. She claimed it was an eyesore, that it disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the block, and that it clashed horribly with her tasteful garden gnomes. I had received more passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox about that windmill than I had Christmas cards, each one scribbled in her tight, angry handwriting, the paper always smelling faintly of lavender and cheap hand lotion. I had tried to be civil at first, explaining that the windmill had sentimental value, that it reminded me of simpler times, of wide open spaces and long winding roads, of dusty highways stretching out beneath an endless blue sky. But Karen didn't care about sentimentality. Karen cared about property values and neat, orderly lawns and gardens that looked like they had been ripped straight from the pages of a glossy home and garden magazine. So when the windmill went missing one foggy autumn morning, I knew exactly who to blame. I had stepped out onto my porch, mug of steaming black coffee in hand, the chill of the morning air biting at my cheeks, and stopped dead in my tracks. My windmill, the centerpiece of my carefully curated chaos, the rusty heart of my little suburban sanctuary, was gone. I stood there for a moment, blinking in the grey, misty light, my mind struggling to process the gaping hole in my flower bed where the windmill had once proudly stood. The ground where it had been planted was disturbed, the soil freshly turned, the small, wind-blown weeds clinging to the edges like desperate survivors clinging to a sinking ship. I set my coffee down on the porch railing, my fingers tightening into fists as a slow, simmering anger began to build in my chest. This was no accident. Windmills don't just get up and walk away in the middle of the night, creaking metal blades and all. No, this was the work of Karen. It had her petty, passive-aggressive fingerprints all over it. She had probably snuck into my yard in the dead of night, her little garden clippers in one hand, a flashlight in the other, muttering to herself about property values and neighborhood standards as she wrenched my beloved windmill from the ground. I stormed down the porch steps, the wet grass squelching beneath my boots as I made my way to the flower bed, my breath fogging in the cool morning air. I knelt down, brushing the loose, damp soil away with one hand, my fingers trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The metal post of the windmill had been yanked out cleanly, the roots of the nearby flowers torn and twisted, the small, delicate white petals scattered across the ground like the aftermath of a violent storm. I stood up slowly, my fists clenched, my jaw set, my mind racing with 1,000 furious thoughts. I knew where to find her. I knew exactly where she'd stashed it, too. Karen had a little garden shed tucked away behind her perfectly manicured hedges, a small white-painted structure with bright blue shutters and a neatly trimmed row of lavender bushes lining the path to the door. It looked like something out of a children's storybook, the kind of place where you might expect to find a kindly old grandmother baking pies and knitting socks for her dozen or so cats. But I knew better. That shed was Karen's lair, her fortress of solitude, her little slice of passive-aggressive paradise, where she plotted her next HOA complaint and sharpened her garden shears like some suburban Bond villain. I took a deep breath, my mind made up, my course set. I would march over there, demand my windmill back, and give her a piece of my mind in the process. Maybe even toss in a few creative insults about her gnome collection while I was at it, just to drive the point home. I turned, storming back up the porch steps, my boots clomping loudly against the old, weathered wood, and threw open the door, grabbing my jacket from the coat rack by the door. As I stepped back out onto the porch, my heart still racing, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts of steam in the cool morning air, I paused for a moment, my fingers tightening around the edge of the doorframe. I glanced back at the empty flower bed, the windmill-shaped hole in my carefully cultivated chaos, the disturbed soil still clinging to the twisted roots of my trampled flowers. "Oh, Karen," I muttered under my breath, my lips curling into a bitter, angry smile. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed." With that, I slammed the door behind me, my boots crunching against the gravel as I made my way down the front steps, my jacket flapping in the cold morning breeze like the wings of some avenging angel. I could already see Karen's little white shed in the distance, the morning fog swirling around it like a ghostly shroud, the lavender bushes swaying gently in the wind, the bright blue shutters staring back at me like the cold, unblinking eyes of some ancient, malevolent spirit. I had no idea then just how right I was. As I neared Karen's garden shed, I felt the unsettling sense that something was off. The air was thick with tension, the fog still clinging to the earth like a dense blanket, muffling everything. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath, and the distant hum of traffic was drowned out by the oppressive quiet. It was as if the world had gone still, watching me, waiting for something. I could feel the old neighborhood around me, its charm and manicured perfection, now twisted into something menacing, as though the well-kept lawns and picture-perfect flower beds were hiding secrets, dark and ancient, lurking beneath the surface. A knot formed in my stomach as I walked toward the shed, my steps slower, more deliberate, as the small hairs on the back of my neck prickled in discomfort. I didn't believe in curses, not in the traditional sense anyway. I had always been the kind of person to scoff at superstitions, to roll my eyes at people who feared black cats and ladders. But this was different. Karen wasn't just some meddlesome neighbor. She had crossed a line. She had stolen my windmill, and now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of something strange. I reached the shed, my fingers curling around the rusted handle of the wooden door. I could hear the faint creak of the old hinges as I pushed it open, and the smell of musty wood and stale air hit me like a wall. Inside, the small shed was a cluttered mess of gardening tools, bags of fertilizer, and various other odds and ends that Karen had collected over the years. But there, in the center of the clutter, was the windmill. It was leaning against the wall, its blade still and silent, its red and white paint chipped and faded, looking even more worn down and forlorn than before. I felt a strange shiver crawl down my spine as I stepped closer, my eyes fixed on the windmill, the object of my wrath and Karen's latest victim. But something was different about it. I hadn't noticed it at first, but as I stared at it, I realized that the windmill had changed. The blades, once rusted and harmless, now looked darker, almost ominous. The faded red had deepened to a deep blood-like hue, and the white paint was cracked, revealing patches of blackened metal beneath. The windmill looked as though it had absorbed the very essence of the darkness that had invaded the morning fog. A feeling of unease settled over me, my fingers tightening around the handle of the door as I slowly stepped closer to the windmill. It seemed to loom over me as if it were alive, its twisted metal and rusted edges calling to me, whispering something I couldn't understand. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping several degrees in the blink of an eye. I shook my head. trying to push the feeling aside. It's just a stupid decoration, I muttered to myself, forcing my feet to move forward. It's not cursed. There's no such thing as curses. But even as I said the words, a nagging voice in the back of my mind told me that I was lying to myself. The moment I touched the windmill, I felt a sharp, biting cold shoot up my arm as though the windmill itself was alive, feeding off my warmth. I jerked my hand back, my heart racing in my chest. I looked down at the windmill again, and for the briefest moment I could have sworn I saw it twitch. The blades seemed to quiver in the stillness, as if some dark energy had awakened inside it. That's when I heard the noise, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the whisper of wind through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though 1,000 voices were speaking in unison, murmuring something I couldn't quite hear. The air around me thickened, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the earth groaning like an old man waking from a long nap. I took a step back, my eyes wide, my breath shallow, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but my feet felt frozen to the ground, as if the very earth itself was holding me in place. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, the voices pressing in around me, making it impossible to think. And then, through the whispers, I heard a single word: Karen. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The shed door creaked again, slowly and deliberately, as if pushed by an unseen hand. I felt a chill run down my spine as I turned to face the door, and there she was, Karen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her hair disheveled, and her body trembling as though she had just been through some kind of terrible ordeal. She was standing in the doorway of the shed, her hands clutching at her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I froze, unsure of what to say or do. Karen had never looked like this before. She was always put together, her neat little garden shed and perfect little house always a reflection of her polished, smug demeanor. But now she was different, broken, desperate, and terrified. "Oh, what's happening?" she stammered, her voice shaking. "What's wrong with the windmill? Why does it feel wrong?" I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her she had finally crossed the line and was reaping the consequences of her petty, nosy behavior. But before I could utter a single word, the ground beneath us trembled and the windmill began to creak and groan as if it were waking from a long, dark slumber. And then the whispers stopped. In the deafening silence that followed, Karen let out a strangled scream. The windmill's blades spun, slowly at first, then faster, picking up speed with each passing second. The air grew thick and heavy, the very fabric of the world around us warping, as if the windmill was pulling us into some otherworldly dimension, a place where rules of nature no longer applied. I reached out to grab Karen's arm, but she yanked away, her eyes wide with terror. "It's coming for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the windmill's spinning blades. "It's going to take me. It's going to take me." In that moment, I realized that the windmill wasn't just a decoration. It was something far more sinister, something ancient, something cursed. And now Karen was about to learn the true price of her action. Karen's eyes were wide with terror, her body trembling as she backed away from the windmill as if the very sight of it had driven her to the edge of madness. And maybe it had. The way the windmill's blades spun faster and faster, cutting through the thick fog like some malevolent force. It felt like the world itself was unraveling, spinning out of control. The air was thick, swirling with an unnatural energy, and I could feel it deep in my bones that something was happening. Something dark and powerful was being unleashed. But Karen, she was lost in her panic. I could see it in her wide, frantic eyes, the way she clutched at her chest, her breath coming in shallow, gasping waves. She was shaking like a leaf caught in a storm, her legs unsteady beneath her, as if the ground itself were shifting beneath her feet. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please make it stop. I didn't mean to, I cut in, my own voice shaking, though for entirely different reasons. Anger bubbled up inside me like a boiling pot, the injustice of her actions finally hitting home. You stole my windmill, Karen. You took something that meant something to me, something with a history, something with meaning, and now you're standing there, crying like you're the victim." Karen's eyes snapped to mine, guilt flashing in them for a split second before the terror returned. "I didn't know," she cried out, her voice rising with desperation. "I didn't know it was cursed. I didn't know anything about this. It was just a stupid decoration to me. You didn't know?" I scoffed, stepping closer, the words slipping out of me faster than I could stop them. The absurdity of it all, the petty theft, the damage, the complete disregard she'd shown for the boundaries of my yard, of my things, made my frustration boil over. "Well, I hate to break it to you, Karen, but you just took something with a past, something that's been around for decades, a relic of something long gone, and now you're standing here, pleading for mercy like some poor, innocent soul. You made your bed, lady. Now lie in it." I wasn't sure why I was so angry. Sure, it was frustrating, annoying even, but there was more to it now. There was something more dangerous than just Karen's petty theft. The windmill had become something else, something powerful, something alive, and it was clear that the longer Karen stood there, the more she'd suffer. The windmill's blade spun faster, the creaking of its rusted joints filling the air, and I swear I felt the ground tremble beneath me. The once stale air now crackled with the tension. I glanced over at Karen, and I could see the dawning realization in her eyes. This wasn't some silly misunderstanding anymore. Whatever was going on here was beyond both of us, and the consequences were rapidly spiraling out of control. "I didn't mean to," Karen pleaded again, her voice higher now, more frantic, as if the full weight of her mistake was crashing down on her. "I didn't know it was. What is this? What's happening?" I shook my head, my own sense of dread creeping into my voice now. "It's too late for that, Karen. You've done something. I don't know what exactly, but this windmill, it's not just a decoration, and you've triggered it." The windmill creaked, and the sound became a low groaning growl, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. I could feel the change in the air, the way the atmosphere had shifted, become thick and heavy, like something ancient was stirring in the very earth beneath us. The fog around the shed seemed to grow denser, more oppressive, as if the very landscape itself was becoming a part of whatever curse had been unleashed. I took a step back, my eyes still locked on the windmill, as the air hummed with a strange energy. Someone was calling out from within it. Karen's breathing grew more erratic as she continued to back away from the windmill, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I could see that, deep down, she realized she couldn't run from this. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape. Whatever had been triggered was already in motion. The windmill had become a vessel for something darker, something more ancient than either of us could possibly comprehend. It was then that I noticed something that made my heart stop in my chest. The windmill's blades, once spinning at a normal, albeit creepy speed, had slowed down. But now they weren't just spinning, they were changing. They looked as though they were shifting, growing larger, more imposing. They creaked and groaned with each turn, as though they were grinding against something unseen, something deep within the earth. Then, with a violent snap, the windmill's blades stopped moving entirely. The silence that followed was so thick I could almost hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood frozen, staring at the now motionless windmill, a sick feeling settling deep in my stomach. I turned to Karen, my mouth suddenly dry. "You've done something. You've unleashed something that shouldn't have been touched." Karen's face was ashen, her lips trembling as she stared at the windmill, her whole body now frozen in place. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The color drained from her face, and it was clear that she was no longer the person who had started all this mess. She had been thrust into something far beyond her control, and now she had to face the consequences. Before I could say anything else, the windmill began to hum. Not the windmill itself, not the old, creaky blades, but something else, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth itself, a sound that made my chest rattle and my teeth ache. It was like the hum of a power line on the brink of a storm, a sound that made the air feel thick with static. The fog around us began to dissipate, swirling in on itself like a vortex, and through the clearing mist I saw them, shadows. Not normal shadows, but shadows that moved, that shifted and writhed as if they had minds of their own. They slithered across the yard, past the shed, and into the trees like dark, crawling tendrils, reaching out, searching for something. And I realized with growing horror that they were searching for Karen. The shadows moved like liquid darkness, creeping toward Karen with a speed that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it was deliberate, almost as if the shadows were sentient, purposeful in their pursuit. I could see them undulating through the air, slipping through the cracks in the shed, pooling like ink at Karen's feet. The hairs on my neck stood straight up as I instinctively stepped backward, my feet scraping against the ground, my eyes wide, and my heart thudding painfully in my chest. Karen, of course, hadn't noticed them at first. She was too busy staring at the windmill, her face still pale, her lips trembling in shock. But as the shadows crept closer, brushing past her like the fingers of some unseen force, she finally snapped out of her daze. Her head whipped around, her eyes wide with terror, as she saw the swirling black shapes forming around her. What are they?" she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, her throat constricted in panic. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't have the words for this. I had thought Karen was bad enough as a neighbor, stealing my decorations, causing a nuisance with her nosiness. But this was something else entirely. Whatever had been set in motion by her actions was far beyond anything I had ever experienced, and now she was paying the price. "It's the curse," I said, my voice almost a growl, as I struggled to keep the fear from seeping in. "You shouldn't have touched it. The windmill. It wasn't just some stupid garden ornament. It's ancient, Karen. Something dark is tied to it, and now you've unleashed it." Karen's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked almost pitiful. This woman who had thought she could get away with petty theft, with encroaching on someone else's life, now trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. She stumbled backward, her legs wobbling beneath her as the shadows closed in, wrapping around her like a tightening noose. "No, please, I didn't mean it. I didn't know," she cried out, her voice high-pitched, full of raw fear. The more she struggled, the more the shadows seemed to bind her in place. She was gasping for air now, her breath shallow, eyes wide with panic, as the dark tendrils of the curse wrapped around her legs and arms, pulling her towards the center of the yard, right next to the cursed windmill. I stood there, helpless, a pit forming in my stomach as I watched the scene unfold. This was beyond anything I could have predicted. I had been angry at her for taking my windmill, for her utter disregard of my boundaries, but now I was terrified. I had no idea what kind of power had been awakened, no idea how to stop it, and I sure as hell didn't want to find out. Karen's hands reached out toward me, her fingers trembling as she screamed, "Help me, please." But the curse was stronger now, pulling her into the center of the yard with a force that left me frozen in place. The more she screamed, the tighter the shadows gripped her, as if the darkness itself was feeding off her fear. But just when it seemed like the curse was about to claim her entirely, something strange happened. A flicker, almost imperceptible at first, as if the very air around us had shifted. The shadows wavered, their movements becoming less fluid, more jagged, as though they were being pulled back by some unseen force. The windmill, too, seemed to be reacting. The air around it rippled with an unnatural energy, and for a moment the darkness around Karen seemed to falter, like the curse was uncertain, like it didn't know what to do next. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just stand there. Karen might have stolen my windmill. She might have been a nuisance, but no one deserved this. No one should have to face whatever this was. I took a tentative step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. "Karen," I called, my voice shaking. "Hang on. You need to stay calm. It's trying to feed off your fear. Don't give it what it wants. Breathe. Focus." But Karen wasn't listening. She was writhing in panic now, her screams growing louder, more desperate. She had already given in to the terror, and the curse was feeding on it, growing stronger, more insistent, pulling her closer to the windmill with every passing second. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something moving behind the windmill. A figure. No, not a figure. A shadow. A tall, dark silhouette, like a person, but not quite. It had the shape of a man, but its features were blurry, indistinct, shifting, like it was made of smoke, something unreal, and it was approaching Karen. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Whatever had been bound to the windmill, the curse, the shadows, the dark presence, it wasn't just the windmill itself. It was something more, something ancient and powerful, and it was hungry. Hungry for Karen's fear, hungry for her soul. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to think. With a burst of adrenaline, I sprinted forward, leaping past the windmill and toward Karen. The shadows recoiled for a moment, as though the windmill itself was reluctant to let me interfere. But I didn't stop. I reached out, grabbed Karen's wrist, and yanked her backward, away from the swirling dark tendrils that were now almost engulfing her. "Let's go!" I shouted, pulling with all my strength, desperate to get her out of the curse's grip. But Karen's legs buckled beneath her. She wasn't fighting anymore. Her body seemed to go limp, her face pale and exhausted. Her eyes, once full of panic, were now clouded with resignation. The shadowy figure moved closer, and I felt the air grow colder, sharper. I knew that if I didn't do something, anything, right now, it was over. "Karen, no!" I yelled, trying again to pull her up, but she was too weak. She was losing herself to the curse. It was then that I remembered something I had heard about, but never truly believed. A way to break a curse. But it wasn't a method I'd ever wanted to use. It required something more than physical effort. It required belief. I focused on the windmill, on the eerie stillness of the spinning blades, the darkness around us. There was no time to hesitate. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer I hadn't said in years. "Please let her go. Take me instead." The words left my mouth before I could fully process them, the prayer feeling as though it had come from someone else, as though the universe itself had whispered them into my mind. I felt the power of the windmill, its ancient energy stirring deep within the ground beneath me. The shadows seemed to pause for a brief haunting moment, their dark tendrils recoiling, hesitating, as if they, too, were listening. For a moment everything stopped. The world itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended in time. The windmill's blades creaked slowly, grinding against the unseen forces that had kept them in motion. The shadows hovered, uncertain, as if they were no longer sure of what they should be doing. I could feel the weight of the curse pressing in around me, a suffocating presence, but also something else, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, I could reverse this. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself amidst the chaos. I had never believed in curses, not truly, but there was no denying that something unnatural was happening here, and the only thing I could do now was trust in what I had just done. The dark figure behind the windmill, still indistinct, shifting like a mirage, began to move forward again, but this time it hesitated. It was as though my words had somehow affected it. Maybe the curse wasn't just about fear. Maybe it was about intention, about will, about the very essence of the power that had been tied to the windmill. I glanced down at Karen. Her body was limp in my arms, her eyes half closed, her skin clammy with the sweat of fear. She was no longer screaming, no longer fighting. She had given up, resigned to whatever fate had awaited her. The curse had drained her, had taken everything from her except the raw, helpless terror that clung to her like a second skin. But I couldn't let that be the end. Not for her, not for me. With another surge of determination, I stepped forward, pulling Karen with me. The shadows hissed at the movement, recoiling, as if the very act of us moving toward the windmill disturbed the delicate balance of the curse. I didn't care. I had to get to the heart of this, had to confront the force that had been set loose by Karen's thoughtless actions. The windmill, still eerily silent, now seemed to be listening to me. I could feel its power responding to my will, the ancient energy that had been dormant for so long flickering to life, feeding off the remnants of the curse that still hung heavy in the air. "Enough," I whispered, more to myself than to anything else. "Enough of this." I pulled Karen forward, my hands now gripping her tightly as I dragged her away from the encroaching shadows. The darkness seemed to fight back, writhing around us, attempting to reclaim its prey, but I could feel it weakening. The more I moved forward, the less the shadows seemed to have any hold on us. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The shadows evaporated, dissipating into nothingness, leaving only the stillness behind. The air, thick with tension just moments ago, now felt oddly empty, as if the weight of the curse had lifted entirely. The windmill's blades slowed to a stop, their groan of resistance finally fading into silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, my chest heaving with the exertion, looking around at the sudden calm. The fog that had once enveloped the yard was now completely gone. The windmill, though still imposing, seemed less menacing, its power finally quelled. Karen, still in my arms, had regained some of her strength. She blinked a few times, staring around in confusion, as though she wasn't entirely sure what had just happened. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She was still too shaken, still too caught in the aftermath of her ordeal. What was that? She finally croaked, her voice hoarse, her eyes still wide with the ghost of the fear she had felt moments before. I didn't answer at first. I couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat, and I was still trying to process everything that had just occurred. The curse, the shadows, the figure. It was all too much. I wasn't sure how to explain it, how to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't even know if I fully understood it myself, but I did know one thing for certain. Karen had learned her lesson. Whatever had happened, whatever curse had been unleashed, she had been forced to confront it, to experience the consequences of her actions in a way she would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, she would think twice before stepping on someone else's property again. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice softer now, though still strained. Karen nodded slowly, still looking around with wide, uncertain eyes. She didn't look at me, not directly, but instead focused on the windmill, as if it were the source of all her fear. And in a way, it had been. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice still trembling. "I had no idea. I didn't know it was cursed." I shrugged, my breath still coming in uneven bursts. "You didn't know," I said, but I couldn't bring myself to feel any sympathy for her, not after everything she'd put me through. "But you know now." There was a long silence, the kind that stretches out uncomfortably, before I finally let go of Karen's arm and stepped back. The windmill still stood before us, its ancient presence lingering in the air like a reminder of everything that had just transpired. Karen took a shaky step backward, her eyes flicking nervously between me and the windmill. She opened her mouth to speak, but then stopped, shaking her head as if she couldn't find the words. "Goodbye, Karen," I said, turning away from her and making my way back to the house. "Consider this a lesson learned." I didn't look back, but I could hear her footsteps faltering behind me. I knew she would leave. She had no choice. The curse was broken, and whatever she had come to take from me had been returned to its rightful place, whether she wanted it or not. And as I walked back to the house, I couldn't help but wonder if Karen would ever truly understand the price of her curiosity, if she would ever realize that sometimes some things are better left untouched.